Hello, everyone, and welcome again to indeed another life science lecture webinar hosted by us, by EUCOPE. And we are, of course, the European Confederation of Pharmaceutical Entrepreneurs. We're essentially a business association representing mostly the smaller and mid-sized companies active in biotechnologies, but also pharmaceuticals and medical technologies. And this is already the 10th episode of our own EUCOPE webinar series, where we essentially cover a whole range of topics in the world of life sciences. And today, I must say, we're going to talk about a very ambitious piece of legislation, of course, the European Health Data Space. I would say it's a far-reaching EU regulation that is essentially going to determine also in the future how health data is going to be lawfully shared in Europe, also abroad. So we go by means of introduction. My name is Leander Vranken, and within EUCOPE, essentially are a digital health lead, covering topics such as digitalization, AI. So hence you also listening to me here today. But first things first, I see that there are still people dropping in, so we can kick off the meeting fairly soon. So also welcome, warm and fantastic welcome to our guest, who I will introduce to you in just a few moments. We luckily managed again to get a great panel, stretching, of course, also from the regulators. So we have the European Commission on board, but also from the company perspective, the legal side of things. So great outcome again. And today, we're going to, of course, talk about the European Health Data Space, and particularly the secondary use, also its implementation and company implications. So it just entered into force, so it's a massive potential. Hopefully, it's also able to live up to its promise. But it's all about implementation now. But before we go into any of that, I'd like to welcome my fantastic panelists. We have, of course, the regulator on board, Jerome de Barros. He is the policy officer at the Digital Health Unit of DG SANTE, of course, in the European Commission. And he is also particularly involved in developing the secondary use of the EHDS. He's also involved in several implementing projects. So in short, he's the right man to talk about EHDS implementation today. So Jerome, many thanks for being here. Thanks, Jerome. And also, Jerome is not a stranger to us. We also sat with him during the Life Science College of Sidley, Austin, and EUCOPE, what we did last year. But we also talked a little bit about implementation already, but we didn't have a text back then, so which we certainly do have right now. So that certainly makes things easier. Yes, also of we also have Zinovia Chatzidimitriadou with us. She's senior managing associate at Sidley Austin, and I must say also that Dina has been a great help to us, to EUCOPE, also navigating through the sometimes tough legal material of the EHDS. For that matter, she's a true expert on a variety of matters, particularly also with IP, when it comes to IP and also artificial intelligence. And Sina, you were also with us during the last webinar. Again, many thanks for being here as well.
Thank you for this kind introduction, Leander, and it's always a pleasure being here.
Thank you. And it's also a great pleasure, of course, to have with us today Lorenzo Perino, and he's a data engineer at Orion Pharma. They're all, of course, a EUCOPE member. It's a Finnish pharmaceutical company, also with a global outreach, broad portfolio. The core of their pharmaceutical research and development is also in oncology and in pain. And at Orion, Lorenzo has also a focus on a large-scale critical data solution, also to support, of course, the research of Orion, and I must say that Lorenzo and his team, they are of course well aware of the importance of the EHDS, especially in terms of the data sets that will become available, large and high quality data sets become available, but also of course IP protection and safeguard secrets. So thanks, Lorenzo. It's great to be that we have you on board as well to come and really also on the company perspective, the opportunities, of course, also the challenges. So many thanks, Lorenzo, for being here.
Thank you, Leander. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Thanks, Lorenzo. Before we jump in, please be aware also that this is a live webinar, of course, and it's also being recorded, so you can watch it back whenever you want or share it with someone else. And we try to make this also as interactive as possible. So should you have any questions, please drop them also in the chat section. So there should be a function down below where you can answer your questions or leave comments. And of course, goes for the same for our panelists, so please feel free to engage with each other, ask questions and comments as we go along, so that we prevent endless monologues, which I'm doing right now. So we are almost there. We do have a few slides, if we can start sharing those to help us navigate us through today's material. Try to get those up in a sec. Yeah, there we go. Indeed, the implementation of the EHDS, yes, in your journey from regulation to implementation, it's part 2. So we already the first webinar, so the legal text then was not agreed on yet, so it was still going through a legal cleanup, but we managed already to discuss at that time quite a lot of the legal implications, and now we're going to look, of course, at the implementation, how that's potentially going to look like. So we really want to look at the regulation itself, particularly the secondary use, of course, what we can expect during the implementation phase, and of course also from a pharmaceutical industry perspective, how that's all being perceived, and of course at the legal implications. So let's quickly have a look at today's agenda. Indeed, so we first start quickly with a welcome and introduction. That's essentially going on right now, a brief overview, also the relevance and the objectives. Then we quickly move to Jerome, our commission speaker, who touches a little bit on the secondary use of the electronic health data, of course, the key benefits, also the user journey. So you as a pharmaceutical company, how is that going to look like? Also safeguards, so the safe processing environment, IP mentioned already, in trade secret safeguards. Before we move on to Lorenzo to talk a little bit on the pharmaceutical industry perspective, the opportunities and challenges, before we also go to the use of artificial intelligence within the EHDS, also very important. So the opportunity there and user cases, and also we talk a little bit about the secondary use of data for pricing and reimbursement purposes. I get recently a lot of questions on that as well. So it's good that we can spend some time to that as well. Next slide, please. Then, of course, very importantly, the implementation and the next steps. So the implementation timeline, of course, implementing acts and guidance that we can expect. Again, Jerome will walk us through this. Ongoing initiatives and stakeholder engagement. And so how can we be involved as well? Also governance, so the role is very important role of and responsibilities of the health data access bodies, the obligations and the rights, of course, of a data user, data holder, and the legal implications of the EHDS compliance in the future, of course. Very quickly to the next slide. I hope this will not take longer than 2 minutes, but yeah, indeed, be advised, of course, that this is already an existing European legislation. So we're not talking about a deal or a text or what still needs to go to a revision. So this is already an existing European legislation. So the final text indeed was already approved on the 17th of December by the Parliament, and also got adopted by the Council, of course, on the 21st of January, signatures on the 13th of February 2025. And then we saw its publication in the official journal of the EU on the 5th of March, and it entered into force on the 25th of March. So it's already an existing regulation. Next slide, please. Yeah, very quickly an overview. Of course, the EHDS regulation aims to establish, of course, a common framework for access, use, and exchange of electronic data across the EU, which is really special if you think about it. At the moment, it's first of its kind, first of all, but second, at the moment, of course, data sharing, especially health data sharing in Europe, is fragmented. It's the patchwork essentially of 27 different ways of how health data can be shared. So this is really, this aim to establish this common framework is quite revolutionary. And of course, its objective is the effective use of health data. It's two-folded essentially. I won't cut too much grass for our commission speaker, but it's essentially there's a primary use and a secondary use. We're going to focus on the secondary use of health data for research and public purposes, of course. So data will be made available for research and innovation, also policy making, and the health data access body will oversee that. Next slide, please. Then, of course, what does EUCOPE want to achieve? Well, of course, a well-functioning EU common framework that allows for the wider reuse and health data for research and innovation, of course. I think I won't go through all of this also in the essence of time, as I'm taking more time already than expected, but we really would like to, of course, see a harmonized implementation of the common EU rules, of course, also highest IP and trade secret safeguards, and also invest in the capacity building. So think here of structured training, education of staff. This all has to be implemented, of course. Speaking of quickly of some timeline, we will see phased implementation stretched over 2 and 4 years. We'll get to that in just a sec. But now, the EHDS legal text is still very high level, and of course, in our point of view, requires a lot of implementation work, also guidance. That is essentially what we are hope to see as we go forward. And I think if we go to the next slide, we already start with our first speaker. Indeed, Jerome, the floor is yours. I don't hope that I cut already too much grass away there, but
not at all. Not at all. And thank you, Leander. So as you said, I think for this workshop, we'll focus on the secondary use. And if you go to the next slide, when we talk about the secondary use, the reuse of health data, we are looking at this use for research and any other kinds of public interest purposes. So innovations, policy making, regulatory purposes, and make sure it is done in a safe and secure way. And if you go to the next slide, there we go. So in a nutshell, what we have here under this part of regulations for secondary use is just common European rules on who has to make what kind of data available and specifying for which purposes, and then determining what are the conditions. So this is really determining all of different elements. Who will be the users, what will be made available, under which conditions, and for which purposes. It's always important to remember that consent is not the legal basis to access the data by the data access bodies. So this differentiates itself from other, for example, legal frameworks for accessing health data in a national level. And it also foresees the possibility for citizens to opt out from the use of their data. There will be some exceptions for some member states that member states can implement, but all in all, the idea is really to give that possibility. Now, it's important to mention that it will be underpinned by the health data at EU infrastructure. So this will be a common European infrastructure that will facilitate the exchange of information to make this data available. This is not a common infrastructure to centralize any kind of data. No, this is really to make it possible for users to access catalogs of data sets, so to actually be aware of what kind of data can be made available, facilitate the process so that when those relevant data sets have been identified, we can then make it possible to submit an application for the application to be received by the authorities that will be assessing and later on providing access to this data if this access is granted. So this really to facilitate the process of identifications, application for health data. What's the proposal also of the regulation is also about specifying what is the process to access this data. So through data permits or data requests when we are talking about answers in a statistical format. And then it's specifying a series of safeguards I will touch on in the following slides. If you go to the next slide, what's also very important to mention is that this does not, what we are proposing, what we have here in the EHDS framework, does not affect, for example, reporting obligations on pharmacovigilance or notifiable disease reporting. So this all stays the same. It doesn't also replace any existing framework that might be in place at national level. It comes in addition to those. So for example, Finland has a secondary use act. This framework remains in place. They just live in parallel. It cannot be used for law enforcement purposes. So that's also something that is worth mentioning. And if you go to the next slide, I will touch on what is one of the first safeguards, let's just say, that is put in place, that is mandating member states to establish health data access bodies. So this will be the national agency that will be responsible to provide this access. So they will have to a series of tasks. One of them to actually make sure that that is so publish the catalogs, assess and decide on those applications, license the holders. So when they grant access to a specific dataset to a user, they are then licensing with the holders of those datasets to make available to the user. Ensure that indeed, so that ensuring that it gets available, and ensure also public transparency on what kind of data has been applied to, when it was granted. So just really to make it easier for any one of us really to understand what kind of data is made available to whom, for which purposes, but also for prospective users to understand what kind of data set have been made available, what is the typical time it takes to get access to this data. So this transparency goes really a multitude of ways. It's important to mention that member states can designate one or more health access bodies or healthcare systems in Europe, very different from each other. And this is really down to national decisions to structure how will this nomination and the role and tasks of these health access bodies will be organized. So it will be very different from country to country, but ultimately there you will see there's a series of tasks, of decisions that needs to be made that will then be taken depending on the structure that is adopted in the country. Countries, for example, that build on more on a regional base for organizing care or taking decisions can have multiple steps per region, for example. It's also worth mentioning that for data that is held by EU institutions and bodies, we will have a union health data access service, so acting like an HTAB for data set held by those EU institutions and bodies. So think of the EMA, of the GRCs, for example. These are EU bodies that hold data, and the same obligations that apply to member states also apply to the Commission. And if you go to the next slide, so in addition to adding this additional layer of governance and responsibility, so that people are aware that there is a specific agency responsible for access to the data, we have more safeguards on how is data made available. In our case, this is done in a secure processing environment, so a safe space where only authorized users have access to the data in a anonymized or pseudonymized format. The download of personal data is prohibited, so you only have access to the data within that space, and only aggregated results and anonymized data can be extracted. Natural persons have the right to opt out, as I mentioned before, at any time and without stating reasons, unlike, for example, in GDPR. So the idea is that this should be made as easy as possible if that is the choice. But this decision is reversible. That is, if the user, the natural person, anybody of us change their mind, they are able to do so. Other safeguards are legal and organizational measures to protect your property and personal data. We are perfectly mindful that some data sets are particularly sensitive, so we have additional measures for this kind of data. There are obligations to inform individuals about the data use, and they rise under data protection law. So the idea is to make sure that people are aware when their data are being used. And there are those transparency measures that I mentioned before. Finally, concepts like data minimizations and purpose limitations also apply. That is, you would only have access to the data that is commensurate to what you need based on your application. So it wouldn't be a blanket access to any data that may be available. By all means, no, it is really to answer the research questions you're trying to analyze here. And if you go to the next slide, so going back on this point on the legal and so if it entitles IP rights, it does entitle IP rights and trade secrets. So we, as you mentioned, the regulation by design really remains vague because it needs to apply for a long period of time. Also because for very specific aspects like data sets entitling IP trade secrets, more information is needed. We need to have the stakeholders also helping us define what should actually be this kind of safeguard when it comes to these kind of data sets. This is why we launched a co-proposal under the IHI program. So the IHI program is a public-private partnership with the industry, so medtech industry, but also pharma industry. And here, through the projects, we will try to work with them. So have this consortium help us define what kind of measures, what kind of tools and recommendations can be developed to safeguard innovations in second use of health data. And in particular, what kind of tools can help us maintain this right balance between what aims to be achieved with the EHDS, but also ensuring that it maintains a strong intellectual property system. So that's what this consortium will aim to do. Develop these recommendations, the kind of frameworks, guidelines that can be then taken up by the EHDS governance, the board, to make sure that when this kind of data is made available, it is done in a way that is satisfactory and really ensures this strong respect for IP rights and trade secrets. In practice, so the call was open until the 23rd of April. So this is the period during which consortiums were able to submit their proposal. That was the stage one. Those will be assessed in coming weeks, month, and from October on, this is when the winning consortium will be put together with the industry consortiums or the industry partners that will be providing input in kind and in funding to really define what will be the scope of the project. So we hope this project will start around, let's just say Q1 2026, so that we can still have inputs that can be relevant, time for the really the launch of the framework in early 2029. And if you go to the next slide, ultimately this is the kind of benefits we have this regulation was really developed for. And looking at the different users, so for example, for regulators and policymakers, it's really about making it easier to have access to your data so that they can develop better evidence for their regulatory activities or for policymaking in the case of policymakers. For researchers, we all know how difficult it is to have access to developing the studies, developing the solutions, innovations, AI models, whatever that you aim to develop. You need to have access to the right data, to have access to a lot of data. That's what we're aiming to achieve, making sure that our researchers have access to this data with the right quality and in a more cost-efficient manner and in an easier manner, so that you, in one place, you can apply to datasets from across Europe from one single applications. You can have a much better overview of what kind of data exists, when you don't have those links to other data holders, for example. But also the health data access bodies have this possibility to provide linkages across different data sources. So hopefully helping answers more questions that you can now, or at least in a more easy way. For the industry, I mean, those benefits are more or less the same, but the idea is really to also support their research and development activities, and hopefully contributing to more positive in the economy in the health sector. And for patients, the idea is that what is developed is actually for their own benefits. That's why, we talk about purposes that are benefiting the patients ultimately. And on top of that, as mentioned before, we want to ensure transparency on the data use, but also on data application, so that they are aware what kind of data is requested, when it's made available, to whom, for which purpose. So all this kind of level of transparency. If you go to the next slide. So very briefly, here we have what we refer to as the data user journey. So in practice, how do we foresee the process to happen? So starting with the post, a user is able to identify the relevant data set, so understanding what kind of data exists out there that may support the research. 2 is providing the process to access this data. So for a permit application, so making it possible for a user to select data sets to and then place an application explaining what is the purpose they want to access this data for, who will be the users, so that then it can be evaluated by the health data access body, that if they deem it acceptable, will issue a permit. And this is at this stage that data holders are contacted to make this available to the health data access body, which will provide any kind of data preparation where needed, and then make it available to the user in a secure processing environment, only to those users I mentioned before that have been allowed to have access to this data. There, the user has access to the tools, the data itself, of course, but also the tools to be able to analyze and process that data. And what's important is that at the end of the process, we want to make sure that those results are published, that we are aware of what was done, what kind of output were developed, and will be exploited by the user at the end. So bringing more transparency and really ensuring that we are aware what was done in this case. We're not saying that you need to share your models or anything, but just to let us know what took place within that space. And if you go to the next slide, that's where I think we'll have then Lorenzo telling us a bit on this perspective on bringing his point of view from the industry then.
Thank you. Perhaps a quick question before, Jerome, we head over to Lorenzo. On the previous slide, I think it was on the IHI call 10. So these are indeed these recommendations to address the IP, RDP, trade secrets that are, of course, very promising and important. But something I get a lot from our members is, will there also be concrete guidance for the training, also for the health data access bodies? They are essentially the guardian who gets data to what, and of course spotting IP may be more easy than identifying trade secrets, which is always requires a little bit more technical specification. So a question that I get a lot is also whether the Commission is looking specific guidance, and also push for harmonized implementation. Of course, I think if we're gonna have different interpretations and implementation across the board, that goes a bit against the very grain of what the EHDS should be doing.
Certainly. On your first point, when it comes to trainings, indeed, this is one of the outputs we can expect from this project. So for the EHDS, but I think more broadly, I think more not just the EHDS could benefit from such training. So far it will be down to what is proposed. We gave some indications as to what kind of trainings we were looking for, but it doesn't preclude other kinds. So the idea is we put it as how can they support the innovation and data sharing under the EHDS. So this can be quite broad, but we hope that indeed there will be this training will be relevant not only for the EHDS but also for all the other actors more broadly. On top of that, we also specified, the regulation says that the commissions have to develop non-binding models of contractual terms, for example. So we also expect this project to develop tools. So we need to provide them, but we hope this project will also provide some ideas or possible templates we can use to comply with these obligations that we have, just ensuring that the process is as suitable as it can be, but also that all the staff can reuse those tools and in a sense ensure that it's the same everywhere, so that the kind of safeguards you need to put in place for this kind of data are the same. Now, when it comes to your last point on the decision making, it is true that if you want to harmonize the whole process, ideally you want to harmonize it throughout, including on how decisions are taken. This cannot be included in the regulation, but there will be a governance structure put in place we'll be able to touch on later, and they can issue, for example, recommendations or guidelines on how certain aspects can be addressed so that there is uniformity on how this is done, including why not on decision making on how do you analyze a specific request, so that you want to ensure that for the same request for very similar data, you end up with the same outcome. Otherwise, you continue with the same fragmentation without knowing in advance, at least having further certainty as you have now on the outcome of your application. So hopefully it's something we can achieve as well.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Jerome. And I think we now go to the next slide. And Lorenzo, I also before you want to start your intervention to, of course, also elaborate a bit on the pharmaceutical side of things, the opportunities, the challenges. If you have a question for Jerome, if not, we can also move on with your presentation as you wish.
Yeah, hi everyone. I would have a quick question if we still have time. So thank you, first of all, for the clear presentation on key aspects of the secondary use of data in the European health data space, and also for highlighting the safeguards that will be put in place. My question is more about the implementation phase of the European health data space for what concerns the private stakeholders. So what level of workloads, talking about technical or administrative workload, can we expect on the private stakeholder side, especially when it comes to the secure processing environment and data request processes? Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Lorenzo. When I think of private stakeholders, they can really have two roles in EHDS. They can be data holder. Some of them might have data. Some industry partners will definitely have data as well. So in that role, their first obligations will be first to make their kind of data they hold known. So prepare data set descriptions and make it available upon request. But by default, the first one will definitely be to have a data set description. As a user, and a user in a case, for example, when a permit has been granted and having access to data in the secure processing environment, this is the responsibility of the health data access body to determine what will be the secure processing environments in which you will have access to this data. Now, they will take into account recommendations or specifications you will have put in your applications. For example, you might require specific compute power, for example, storage space or specific services. So this will be taken into account. But what is certain is that the health access body is the one then ultimately taking the decision, and two, this will only be in secure processing environments that meet the technical specifications that we are currently developing. And I will touch on this later on when we talk about how you can still participate. So the idea is that we will have what is referred to as an implementing act. So that's a document with further clarifications and technical specifications as to what could constitute a processing environments that can lawfully be used to make data available to a user under EHDS. So this is what will ultimately determine where is data made available in country SPs. For private stakeholders, just defining any kind of requirements they may have, and otherwise being accommodated by the what is provided by the health data access body.
Thank you. Very clear.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jerome. And just very quickly, we have 2 questions in the chat. Lorenzo, sorry to keep you waiting for an extra minute if we can. So a question from Carl Johnson. So can you clarify access to data from a health data access body versus access from a data holder, say data from a hospital that is not a health data access body?
So maybe that wasn't clear when I was presenting the process. So the entity under EHDS that provide this access is always the health data access body. They are the ones granting the access, not the data holder. Data holder comes into play when the health data access body grants access to the data to a user, and data holder make this data available to the health data access body. There may be instances where there's nothing precluding, for example, for a data holder to be the one making it available. That is, if they have an SP and have the capability to make it available, it can be a possibility. We do not preclude any kind of operator of health data access body, and arguably that could be a way to ensure that the data move as little as possible. Now, personally, the way I see it, having access to the data is one thing. The knowledge on the data set that is typically at the hospital of a researcher that have been involved in collecting the data or curating it is also important, and these can be included as data user, for example, or they could be contacted for further clarification by the user. So this doesn't preclude these kind of interactions after that, when even though the permit has been granted by a third party, the health access body. So this doesn't preclude interactions between the hospital, in the example of Mr. Johnson, and the user here as well. But it's true that one of the main differences is that, as you have, for example, in Finland, you have a national body set up to take decisions on the use of data that exists within that country. So regardless of who the user is, as long as it is one of the data types that are covered under the regulation.
Perfect. Thank you, Jerome. I suggest we now move on to Lorenzo's question. We do have another question on clinical trials. Perhaps we can do that after Lorenzo's session, as we are also need to keep in mind the essence of time.
Yes.
Please go ahead, Lorenzo.
Yes. Yes. Hello, everyone. And thank you, EUCOPE, for organizing the event and having me on this webinar. I'm Lorenzo Perino, data engineer at Orion Pharma, and I would like to take you through in today's webinar what are the opportunities and challenges that we at Orion Pharma see with the implementation of the European health data space. Next slide, please. So first of all, just quickly, I would like to introduce Orion Pharma as a company. It's a global operating Finnish-based company in the pharmaceutical sectors, and it obviously manufactures and markets pharmaceutical ingredients, not only for human, but also for veterinary use. Importantly, the main target areas of Orion are 2, and those are oncology and pain treatments. So those are the 2 main therapy areas it focuses on. And as of the end of 2024, 5 are the business areas that compose the company as a whole, that you can see in the corner: innovative medicines, branded products, animal health, and Fermion for the manufacturing of the active ingredients. In a nutshell, it operates across 8 different production sites from Finland to France to Belgium, and it is listed under the Nasdaq Helsinki with over 90,000 shareholders. Next slide, please. Yes, so first of all, now I would like to talk about what we see as opportunities. And first and foremost, the main opportunity we see under the European health data space is an acceleration in the innovation process of our R&D department. So as Jerome already explained, European health data space means centralized data access to high quality data, structured quality data all across Europe. The data of interest for a pharmaceutical company like Orion are obviously multi-omics data, clinical records, clinical outcomes, and even other clinical trials data. And the reason why this is so important for pharmaceutical companies that with higher access to structured and high quality data, we can now observe disease patterns at scale for those that are the therapy areas of interest, so oncology and pain treatments. And we can also observe diverse patient populations. And this means that we can move much faster in our R&D process in the identification of new molecular targets and biomarkers. Not only we can do it faster, so more efficiently, but we can also do it in a more personalized manner, meaning that the treatments that we develop for oncology and pain treatments can more and more be personalized to the underlying biology of the patients, thus achieving greater results, greater effectiveness. Next slide, please. Secondly, the second point is tightly related to the first point, is a huge improvement in rare disease research. So, as it is probably obvious, the main limiting factor when it comes to research in rare disease areas is data scarcity. That is the main bottleneck. And in areas such as rare oncology and chronic pain, that those are the areas of interest, it is very difficult to identify and analyze cohort of patients that are so lowly represented. And this is where the European health data space can really be a game changer, because now with augmented access to, with a centralized access to high quality data on a European level, we can now develop targeted trials for these rare conditions, for these rare disease cohorts, and develop treatments that are targeted for only these rare conditions. So what this does is open the doors for what we define as orphan drugs, and opens doors to areas that were overlooked thus far, not because really the science was not promising, but mainly because we didn't have enough data to support the research we wanted to carry on. Next slide, please. The third major point is augmented access to real-world evidence. So why is real-world evidence relevant for a pharmaceutical company like Orion? That is because once a clinical trial is over and the therapy goes on the market, we can now, if we have augmented access to real-world evidence, we can now observe long-term safety and in real-world settings. So by gaining data from from hospitals and from registries. And this is important because we can observe the effectiveness of our treatments in conditions that are very different from the clinical trials, where all conditions are more controlled and where cohorts are more diverse. This, with the chance to observe long-term safety, we not only support R&D decisions, but we can also support clinical adoption and pricing strategies that reflect the true value that our treatments will bring on the market. Next slide, please. And last but not least is an augmented international competitiveness. So with a centralized access to high quality data, we have now the chance to cut down on R&D timelines. And we can do this by acquiring higher confidence in key areas of clinical trial projects, such as modeling, hypothesis testings, and patient recruitments. Thus, having the chance to shut down a project should it not show any sign of being successful early on. And this is a huge competitive advantage if we think about the fact that a small European player like Orion has to compete in a global market against non-EU companies. That once the European health data space will be a reality, will not have the chance to have the same data advantage as European companies. So in essence, this keeps our pipeline more agile, and it gives us the chance to engage in strategic partnerships with biotech and academic partners. So keeping the company innovative in an ever-changing landscape. Next slide, please. Now, a quick mention of what are the challenges that we see with the implementation of the European health data space. So as Jerome already mentions, there will be an obligation to share sensitive data. And this, of course, poses some questions for private stakeholders, because sharing key data, such as clinical trials data, biomarkers results, data that constitutes the core of the R&D competitive advantage is, of course, could result in a diluted competitive advantage for pharmaceutical companies like Orion. And for this reason, it is very important that the proper safeguards are put in place on how the shared data will be used for secondary purposes. This is probably the most critical point, is how the shared data that are part of the European health data space will be used for secondary purposes. Secondly, is a complex regulatory landscape. Even though it is part of the European health data space, the harmonization across EU members on how data can be retrieved, different nations could come to different interpretation of the legislations. So it is very important to keep data access as harmonized as possible for small companies like Orion to avoid delays in data access, thus potentially to disengagement. And lastly, and importantly, on a practical aspect, is what are the implications in relation to implementation and maintenance of the European health data space on the private stakeholder side. It is important to implement guidelines that are not only detailed on a technical level, but also easy to implement in a way to pose the adequate workload on small to medium enterprises companies like Orion, so that these objectives can be implemented in our roadmap in a timely manner. Next slide. So here are a few remarks I would like to conclude with. How can we get this right? How can we really make the implementation of the European health data space a success? First and foremost, we need to focus on building a robust, simple, and united governance on data sharing protocols. And this has already been addressed. Have clear safeguards on intellectual property and trade secrets, and enable trusted environments for sensitive R&D use, as it's already been done. And the most important, promote public to private dialogue. Thank you for your attention. I think this is it for me.
Thank you very much. Sina, go ahead. I think it's soon about to be, we still have until 16:30 maximum, so we still have a bit of time, but we may need to speed up it a little bit. So Zina, please go ahead. Maybe if there's time for one question on clinical trials, Zina, what do you think? Could we maybe do that afterwards?
We can, yes, and happy to defer to Jerome as well, but essentially the question is what will the impact be on ongoing and new trials? And the way the regulation is stated, again, happy to be corrected, is it doesn't have a time-limited effect. So in essence, as soon as the provisions on secondary use start being applicable, data sets can be requested, and it doesn't apply to data sets created after the entry into application of these provisions, meaning that even data sets held or created now could become subject to data access requests for secondary use in future. So that would apply to ongoing and new trials. But of course, we have the expert on the panel, Jerome.
So, yeah. Sorry, so on that specific, and that what you just described, I think really applies to all the data sets or data types, as just said, are covered. For clinical trials, we are actually just following the existing regulation on clinical trials. So that means that this obligation would apply to clinical trials that have already concluded. The last thing we want is indeed to have very commercially sensitive information like ongoing clinical trials to be made available just for the sake of it. No, really, this would apply to finalized clinical trials. That's the only one type of data where we have this caveat that we also build up on the existing regulations. We didn't want to obviously create any kind of conflict with ongoing ones, plus also from an industry standpoint, that seems to be the fairest way. But what we want to avoid is to have this data not being reused if there is potential for it. That was the intention when we included clinical trials data as well. Sometimes data that was collected for the purpose of a specific trial can also be relevant for further studies later on by our research groups. So that was the intention to include clinical trials in as one of the data categories, one of the data types that are for which the EHDS framework is applicable to. And I'm sorry this wasn't clear enough.
Thank you, Jerome. Very interesting topic. So I think we might have just lost the slides, but they will pop up on the screen momentarily. The next section has to do with the use of artificial intelligence within the European health data space and some use cases. So if we go to the next slide, this is called the Digital Health and AI group. So we had to had a shout out to AI. And just to build up on some of what Lorenzo has already said, starting already from the life cycle of the development of a medicinal product, but also medical device and algorithm in some instances. The use of AI within the data sets obtained from the European health data space, including real-world patient data, can help accelerate the identification of novel drug targets, but also in silico drug screening. So we have those big patient-derived data sets and other electronic health data. And on that, AI algorithms can really help run in silico analysis to identify new targets, but also to assist the repurposing of existing medicines, again, based on patterns observed on health outcomes as obtained from the European health data space. Then moving on to the next stage of clinical trial optimization, from those broad health data sets, it will be easier, again, with using AI potentially, to identify eligible candidates, to design more efficient and representative trial protocols, but also use predictive modeling of potential trial outcomes, dropouts, and adverse events. So a lot of promise there for potential data users. As Jerome said, he mentioned public-private partnerships and collaborative research and enabling innovation is one of the key ambitions of the European health data space. So a lot of use for AI-driven research initiatives or the development of shared models, harvesting the data to be acquired for secondary use purposes. A lot of us are regulatory affairs and legal professionals, so compliance operations can really be facilitated. We can have AI-assisted evidence packages, either for regulatory submissions using that data or even for pricing and reimbursement, as mentioned further down. That can also help simulation potentially of long-term treatment effects in diverse populations. This is particularly relevant for orphan conditions or for gene therapies where long-term follow-up is key, and sometimes regulators need to see or have an idea of the data in order to grant either conditional or full approvals. And of course, we have personalized and precision medicine. And again, Lorenzo mentioned genomic data. So AI-driven predictive models can really help us increase the production of tailored therapeutic approaches, identifying biomarkers, companion diagnostics on the basis of those integrated data sets. And those really are parts of what the EHDS plan had in mind. I will pause here. I have a question to Jerome, if that's okay, because as someone thinking about AI quite a bit, I was wondering if, there is a lot of concern about the use of sensitive data, such as genomic data obtained through the European health data space. So are there any thoughts of the Commission or plans to address any concerns about AI-driven analytics of such sensitive data? And that's a question especially because patients have the option to drop out, to withdraw their consent of use for such data. So is there anything about that, Jerome, as far as you know?
I mean, in the first place, it starts with the safeguards that I mentioned before that are put in place. Have a national agencies that is responsible to assess what and upfront assess, who will have access to data, what is the purpose, who will be the users. It's already a first check. Secondly, data is only available in a secure processing environment. That is, you don't have a copy going to the user servers, for example, or the data access is fairly limited, at least as to who can access it and what can come out as well. We want to, plus the data is only made available in an anonymized, obviously anonymized format, so we don't have any identifiers made available when data is made available to a user. So the series of safeguards we try to put in place when data is made available on EHDS, regardless of the type. For genomic data, we understand the additional challenges it presents. That's why we delayed the availability of this, or making this available for EHDS until 2 years after, so 2031. Simply to give us a bit more time, to give the agencies, national agencies, more time to really be ready. So just not having to deal with kind of data from the onset. But we also understand the potential. I mean, if you want to create a framework that enables the release of health data for the years to come, you simply couldn't leave out genomic data. So that's why we try to, as much as possible, adopt a balanced approach, or more staggered approach, really, to ensure that the actors have some time to gain confidence on the framework when making it available before really touching on genomic data or more recent data types like from wellness apps, for example, as well, that are still meant to be seen. How much potential can they have? What kind of informations really can be obtained under this label, let's say. It was quite interesting that you mentioned, for example, federated learning here. And in a sense, EHDS enables it, because we just say, yes, it has to be available in a secure processing environment, and it doesn't preclude this secure processing environment being made available where the data is currently held, so at the healthcare provider or the research institution. So in principle, federated learning can be enabled, but that will also obviously depend on two things. One, the capabilities, the institutions where data is held, and two, the health access body accepting those secure processing environments to be provided by that entity to comply with the specifications for secure processing environments. So yes, but there obviously will still be some caveats. We also want to make sure that regardless of where or what kind of learning is applied, what kind of access is provided, the safeguards yet remain in place.
Thank you. No, it's great to know the Commission is actively thinking about those topics as well.
Yeah, trying
Thank you
to
very much for that.
and we do, and on that point, maybe it's worth mentioning, and I don't have it in my slides. We do have a project that will look at supporting the health data access bodies in better understanding what will it imply for them to provide access to data for AI, so for the training and validation of AI models. What kind of capabilities will they need to have in place or have access to through third parties? And that includes, for example, building on existing initiatives, for example, the TEF facilities or the AI factories that are, for example, right now in the making. So we want to make sure that the health access bodies also have a link to specific capabilities that may exist in other institutions as well, if that's what's needed. So that's on AI. We're specifically looking at how to make this happen in a way that really answers the needs of users ultimately. That's as much as possible.
Thank you. Great to hear that. Move on, mindful of the time, and the last point on this slide deck, connecting to the next one, is market access and commercial strategy. So AI-based analytics can help in quite a broad way, starting from identifying unmet needs and emerging therapeutic opportunities. This will be quite relevant, especially in light of the new EU Pharma legislation that really focus incentives on addressing unmet medical need. But of course, AI can also help adaptive pricing strategies based on the patterns observed and various health economics and outcomes research. So on the next slide, we're talking about the secondary use of data for pricing and reimbursement purposes. And this covers both use by companies, by pharma companies primarily, or med tech companies for their pricing and reimbursement, but also by health technology assessment agencies in their pricing and reimbursement procedures. So as you might know, one of the grounds for access to such health data by agencies has to do with policy making and activities by public sector bodies to help them fulfill their mandates. So that would cover HTA agencies, but also improvement of the delivery of care or optimization of treatment and the provision of health care. So again, that could cover pricing and reimbursement assessment by national agencies. And that could cover any data, genetic, genomic data, clinical trial data, data from wellness apps, registries, but also reimbursement claims, administrative data, all become accessible. Now, in terms of the opportunities, the good aspects of that, real world evidence can really help provide outcomes against diverse populations, and data from digital technologies, wearables, and really that can also help capture patient report outcomes. So that will help agencies, HTA bodies, to monitor this added value of digital technologies and where they deliver tangible benefits to patients, and that's something else to consider. Now we have the health, economics, and outcomes research and use of real-world cost and outcome data can be used to model cost effectiveness and budget impact and support favorable pricing negotiations with national health technology assessments. So the use of AI models on top of that can help with simulations of reimbursement scenarios on various treatment pathways. So price can be impacted by what EHDS data can be used and in what way. Also, such data could be used for outcomes-based models, especially we have a conditional approval and dynamic pricing settings. We see in Germany, prices could be revisited every year. So if you have the real life data from there, it could be used to support an interim price until further data can be obtained. Of course, we do have some challenges on the other side. A lot of the data coming out of the EHDS might be subject to interpretation, and it could be heterogeneous. Notably, real-world evidence is actively being looked at for regulatory and reimbursement purposes, but it might not always be accepted as equal evidence in such pricing and reimbursement decisions. There can be a lot of uncertainty in what methodologies are being used. And let's bear in mind that a lot of HTA agencies in Europe can use such data to restrict indications to, for example, specific patient subpopulations that may be better responders. Or such data could also be used for downward pricing purposes by agencies. I have at the bottom of the slide the HTA regulation, and this is a new regulation that started being applicable this January. And what this aims to do is to have member states cumulatively report on clinical effectiveness under a joint assessment. And it cannot be uncoupled by the fact that the EHDS facilitates the generation and capturing of data, including real-world evidence and patient-reported outcomes. So it's not unlikely that in the next few years, we will see such data being taken into account for those joint HTA assessments. I will pass back to you, Leander. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Sina. And thank you all three of you. Quite an extensive overview of the secondary use. We now have the last 25 minutes or so to talk about implementation. So Jerome, I would like to give it back to you to talk us a little bit about the implementation of the EHDS going forward, the timelines, also the governance. So please, floor is yours.
Sure. I'll try to be as quick as I can so we still have some time for questions and discussions. So if you go to the next slide here. So here we have the timeline for the application of the EHDS framework. So as you mentioned earlier this year, we had the entry into force, so when the text became law, really. Now the second dotted line you see is the deadline for certain implementing acts. As you said, the regulation as such leaves room for further clarifications. You know, this is a text that is set in stone, so we had to make sure we had some flexibility simply to adapt to aspects we may have overlooked. It's very hard to think about everything, plus technology evolves. You know, new types of data are being collected over time, or new technologies enable different aspects. So we had to have some flexibility on that part, and that's what these implementing acts help to bring. So these are gives room for technical specifications for some aspects of EHDS. For example, by 2027, you will have a first set of technical specifications, but over time may be updated and having the rest of the text continuing to apply. So that's what I mean by this additional flexibility, but also provide more certainty. We have 2 more years to provide with much more details on what constitutes a sequencing environment that is compliant with which you can access data under EHDS. And then 2 years after, 2029, this is the entry to application. So this is from that point on that data users can go to a portal, see the relevant data that exist in Europe, and place an application. That's when it comes to the secondary use. And as I mentioned before, we have selected categories, genomics over omics, and applications for which this will only be possible from 2031 on. Maybe the last arrow in red that you see at the bottom is also to foresee the scaling of the EHDS framework. So right now it will apply to the EU countries, but it doesn't preclude other countries to adhere. So provide they provide the same conditions to our researchers as we will, third countries can be part of the EHDS framework if they comply with the different provisions. And if you go to the next slide. Here we have the roadmap for the implementation. So as you see, it started quite some time ago, 2020. So for the past 5 years, it's really been about just determining a concept of what should be the EHDS really down to until 2029, really having it in place. And before that, we already had a series of projects. The first line you see is TEDA. So that was a consortium of member state entities that helped us shape what should be the EHDS and what kind of existing framework we should look at for inspiration. For example, what is done in Finland, for example, or in France. And so the idea was to have an EHDS framework that does not proposes anything radical. These are all aspects or processes that already are in place in many countries. Then we have the pilot projects to test the feasibility and also gather more insights as to what should be scaled in time to have a working infrastructure and the right processes by 2029. What you see in the scale-up phase, or the orange tabs, are a series of grants or projects that are there to make it possible for national agencies or those health access bodies to be set up and have the right capabilities. And that includes also capacity building, ensuring that they have the right building blocks, let's say, to be able to have a catalog, receive applications, take decisions, communicate the decisions, and make that available if a permit is issued. Also relevant here is data quality utility label. So here it's about, yes, every dataset will have a dataset description, so a very basic description of what is that dataset, who is the controller, and so what purpose is it being used for. We need more information. When you're a researcher, you will definitely need more information to really assess if that dataset is relevant for you or not. So this is what the label will be bringing. And we also have more operational grants to ensure we have the compliance check, so that, you know, when we onboard a new country, what do they need to comply with? And what's also relevant, and I'll touch on a bit more later, is stakeholder engagement. So we need to have a framework to engage more with all the different actors of EHDS. And if you go to the next slide, I will just focus on two different projects. The first one is called TETAS2. That's a project involving agents or entities from all different member states that over 3 years, over 2 months, will be supporting us with the preparation of those implementing, as I mentioned here before. So guidelines, technical specifications on all the aspects you see here listed. I won't go through all of them, but if you go to the next slide, you will see that we will have, the next one will have a second round of a public consultation. So, you know, we're discussing at the beginning, Leander, how can we get involved when you are not, you know, part of this project, is really to go through those different deliverables or technical specifications or guidelines and provide your comments. So later in the year, around September, October, after the summer, you will have the guidelines and technical specifications on all of those different aspects. And these are quite relevant. You know, they touch on the fees, on further clarifications on the different data categories that are covered, the application process or the management of those applications, the systems for this, data minimizations, data ID identification, secure processing environments, how to implement the opt-out. So this is really a crucial part when where we can get inputs from those that are not involved but that have a say because they'll be users or because they are data holders as well. So that really is your time to go through all of those documents once they'll be made available, and for a month then you would have the opportunity to submit your comments, and we will take those into account. And if you go to the next slide, the second one is the data quality and utility label I was mentioning here before. So as I mentioned, the idea is to have a richer metadata for some of the dataset made available. Some metaset, I mean those that have been created or curated with public funds. So for those, data holders will need to provide, in addition to data descriptions, a data quality and utility label. That's why we have the project called Quantum that will develop this, just a common concept of actually what do we mean by data quality and utility of data set. A common concept on also the maturity of data holders. So those are two different aspects really, the intersect quality of the data set, but also what kind of capabilities, what is the maturity in the end of the data holder as well. That's also a very important aspect to take into account when you will be applying for one data set over another. And this project will be determining those. They'll be developing technical specifications for the label. So what will be quality and utility, so will be the label ultimately for those data sets I mentioned before, and the maturity of data holders. So will be the elements taken into account, and how would they be weighed. Finally, they will be piloting and implementing. They are doing that now, to ensure that it is feasible to fill up this label in an efficient way. They're also developing tools that can support. So when you're the holder, you will have access to tools that can help you comply with this obligation. And this piloting will also be useful to get this kind of recommendations to really understand how to implement this in a efficient way. Furthermore, they also have a committee of practice, so they are doing stakeholder engagement now. And as you see in the next slide, because they already have relevant deliverables. So, yes, before that, just to mention, these are just the list of partners that are involved there, and it's led by IAC, so an institute in Spain of public health. And if you go to the next slide, I say this is the right time now because some of the outputs already are there and some very relevant ones. So the specifications for the datasets quality and utility label and the holders maturity, those have already been published and they are right now being for the mid-scale piloting phase, so tested on a wider scale. And if you're more interested, if you look at the next slide, you have the link and the description of what does label, so the kind of the specific, what are the specifications, what are the correlate dimensions that are included in this label, and what are the metrics for each of those dimensions, and the link here to the actual deliverable. The same for if you go to the next slide, for the maturity models. So the project have been running for a year and a half, sensibly. So that's what right now we're seeing the first outputs of this project, and they are really ramping up their stakeholder engagement. So for example, last month they had their first stakeholder event in Rome, where they really want to get feedback on what they've already done now, but more widely also get further takes on how to improve what they're doing. So hopefully relevant to you and important to follow. And if you go to the next slide. Right. Okay, that's when it comes to implementation. So I really went through different projects. So the first slide, that's where you had the timeline, different projects that are ongoing, and then I zoomed down to those two projects I mentioned, TILAS2 and Quantum, as an example of commission or the inputs that we need for refining the framework and making sure we do have the right capabilities, the right governance in place. Touching on governance on the EHDS, if you look at the primary use, that was not within the scope of these presentations, but this is something that already exists. My Health at EU, the infrastructure that will facilitate the exchange of health data for the purpose of providing care, so for primary use, already exists and has been ongoing for quite some years, just on a voluntary basis. With the EHDS, that becomes mandatory. But as part of that, we already have the eHealth network in place. So member states have a say in the running and in the definition of the type of data that are currently exchanged and will be exchanged in the future through the EHDS. But the EHDS brings a new governance in place. So we will have an EHDS board put in place that will be replacing, and gradually we'll see the transitions from this eHealth network to the EHDS board. That is then extended for secondary use to accommodate different kinds of profiles. For some time, we'll have parallel existence. By 2027, we hope to have a complete phase out of the eHealth network. If you go to the next slide, that will bring instead, as I mentioned, the board, where we'll have 2 members from each member state, 1 for primary, 1 for secondaries. That's how it goes beyond the health network. They'll be there really for taking decisions on how to evolve the systems, but also what kind of guidance can be issued on behalf of the member states to bring further clarity to what's in the text or in the implementing acts. I won't go into much detail into exactly the functioning or how it will be organized, but the idea is really to be as representative as possible and involve the right stakeholders where needed. So think about the EMA, EDPB, CDC, so other European agencies, national agencies that, depending on the topic, may have a say. And if you go to the next slide, the other level of governance that is brought by EHDS are the steering groups for the My Health at EU and Health at EU infrastructure. So the infrastructure facilitating the primary use and the secondary use. Here, they will be the ones deciding on the evolution of the implementations and then the evolution of those two infrastructures. So we bring those two levels of governance on the decision making, or more on the, when submitting guidelines, or then to actually running the infrastructures. For example, if you want new countries to be onboarded, they will be done through the steering groups here. If we go to the next slide. The third level of governance is the stakeholder forum. It is a member state-led initiative, but it will rely on close collaborations with all the stakeholders involved. I mean, data users, data holders, but also patient organizations, the academia, consumer organizations. We want to make sure that relevant stakeholders have a say and the possibility to be regularly updated on the functioning of EHDS and where it will evolve. So that's what we'll have the stakeholder forum put in place. So those 3 layers of governance, let's say, that will be put in place to ensure the system works in the first place, but also evolves the right way, that really an answer to the needs of users and other stakeholders. If you go to the next slide. On this last part, when it comes to stakeholder, we believe we couldn't wait, for 2027 and having the stakeholder forum in place before that. The engagement we can do right now is very much dependent on, the availability, like for today, for example, to take part in events organized by third parties to present and also bring further clarifications on what is the EHDS or where we are with the implementation. So we need to have more capacity. That's why we launched a project where we'll have a consultant that will help us with stakeholder engagement, where they will be able to promote what is actually the EHDS, what kind of applications will be coming, but also provide a platform for collecting feedback from the different communities on various aspects. So they'll be running webinars, workshops. We'll have an annual event as well. So every year we'll have the EHDS Day, where we want to bring the community and just discuss, not only update where we are with the implementations, but later on, once we have the system in place, what can we do, what is being done. So try to have a much broader engagement in practice. So right now the proposals submitted or under evaluations, and we hope this project will start this summer or just after. And I think that's it for me. Confirm it, Leander.
Perfect. Yes.
So we still have 7 minutes.
7 minutes. Zina, I would quickly like to pass the ball to you. We are running a little bit out of time. Maybe you can cleverly combine it, but we're running a bit out of time. So maybe if we can quickly go to the last slides.
Thank you,
yes.
Leander. Finally, my fast speaking skills have some use. So I won't go over these slides. I think Jerome covered it very well. Over the next slide, and coming to also Carl's question, what can pharma companies do now to start being in a position to both be compliant, but also in a good position to take advantage of the EHDS? Well, first of all, need to identify which entity, especially for bigger multinational companies, may be seen as a health data holder that would be subject to those requests. So just read the definitions and then identify what data sets, electronic health data would be in scope to share. And that might be a very extensive mapping, data mapping exercise to identify in-scope data, but also what could it be used for. Remind you that health-related scientific research and AI training are purposes in scope for accessing the data. And that data could come from various sources, including clinical trials, reimbursement data, but also third-party training data, meaning under contracts you have with third-party entities. So might really need to think about who holds what data and where, because if it's outside of the EU, it might be outside of scope. You might need to go to your third-party agreements and check what third parties may hold data that would be subject to data sharing provisions. And then the contractual obligations under those contracts might be such that they would cover the obligation of the company as a health data holder to respond to the request promptly. Because essentially, if you receive a request as a pharma company, you have the 3-month time limit to respond. But some of your electronic health data may be held by either in its entirety or in the required formats by other parties. Or other parties might be able to provide data coming from you. So you really need to do quite lengthy audits that might require coordinating with the regulatory teams, clinical teams, medical teams in various jurisdictions, and then really finding out what you have and what could be subject to such requests. Of course, we don't yet quite have very precise guidelines on what those data infrastructures will look like, but Jerome revealed that this is coming up. So data holders, pharma companies as such, will need to establish teams and systems and policies for storing electronic health data and managing those requests. Now, on the next slide, of course, we have the topic of sensitive and confidential electronic health data. IP rights and trade secrets are not themselves a defense or an obstacle to complete blanket refusals of access requests. So companies should identify or maybe even have a traffic light system of the most sensitive data to data that is sensitive to data that can be freely provided and either redacted at the right place or be flagged as such, so companies can respond to access requests quite promptly upfront. So a proactive management of what is IP and commercial data. Also, of course, that is useful for transparency and disclosure obligations under the clinical trial system and under other EMA transparency obligations. So that would be quite a good exercise to bear in mind for EHDS already now. Now, of course, with great obligations come great opportunities. And companies should start considering what useful electronic health data may be held by other companies, where those could be, and how such requests could be justified. In other words, what legitimate purposes under the EHDS could be fulfilled by requesting and accessing the data, so that in 4 years' time, well, a bit under 4 years' time, when such data can become available to you, you'll be able to request them and obtain them in the most effective way. So with 2 minutes to spare, Leander, back to you, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Zina. Perfectly on time. And maybe you have time for one last question. Jerome, that was also mentioned in the Q&A section. So the timelines for the public consultation on guidelines, they were very challenging for the first wave. This was indeed the TEDAS2 guidance. I remember that ourselves as well, where we contributed. That was quite tight. Have you considered extending the timelines for the future consultations?
I know that the contractor is trying to go beyond the 1 month. That is what we had agreed in the first place. So hopefully bring it to 2 months and take into account the feedback we received for the first wave. Now, as you can understand, we have that limitation of 2027 as to when us commissions need to have those inputs, or we need to have access it much before. So by 27, as commissions have all we need to be able to prepare and have those implementing acts in place. So that's why every delay has an impact, because obviously the consortium cannot work on everything at the same time. So that's why we sometimes are quite limited as to how long we can give for external inputs. But I believe this is something we'll try to do, to have at least doubling the time to 2 months.
Thanks, Jerome. And that's it. We're out of time. I would like to thank everyone for your value contributions. Certainly enough to talk about. Maybe even in our next webinar, we discussed a lot. I would like to very much thank also you, Jerome, for your valuable insights. Zina and Lorenzo, also thank you very much for being here. I hope we all learned something new, and yeah, there's definitely still enough to talk about as we continue. So thank you all very much. And we should follow up also with all the people that, or most of the people that attended here, of course. And if you have any questions, please feel free to follow up with me personally. And I would like to thank you all, and I probably see you all in the next one.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Thank you, guys. Thank you.
Thank you.